Okay, no hurry, but we can start anytime.
All righty, folks. Well, sooner we get started, sooner we can finish. So let me introduce myself. My name is Dave. AE7TD is my call sign. We'll talk about call signs later on this evening.
Nice house.
So I just wanted to, my unit for today is to talk about FCC regulations, all the fun stuff that the FCC is going to expect that you know when you get licensed. So why don't we start off just in general? Are there any questions from the material up to now that we can help you with before we go ahead and get started? Not hearing anything. Let's go ahead and get going. Give me a second to get this put together. All righty, so can you see my let's get started slide?
Yep.
Excellent. All right, folks. So let me start off with a request on your side. So much of what we will be talking about today has to do with this graphic that the Amateur Radio Relay Association, ARRL, has put together. If you want to, and I have the URL on the screen there, if you have the capability of copying that down and printing one of those off or having it on the screen while you're looking at the screen sharing or somehow be able to refer to it, we will be using this as a cheat sheet for many of the questions that we will be going through. So I'll leave that up for a couple of minutes to have some folks copy that URL, arrl.org/graphical-frequency-allocations. So let me tell you what this is. The FCC, in its infinite wisdom, although this is actually across the world, that these allocations have been assigned for amateur radio operators to use for communications. This is both one of the sources of great interest that will be on your part and one of the greatest frustrations that you will have as new amateur radio operators. And the reason why is because each of these bands have different purposes in real life. They have different properties and characteristics for radio propagation and for when they can be effectively used. Some are during the day bands, some of them are during the evening bands. One of the things that you will get into later on in the course is we'll talk about radio propagation and why these different bands have these different characteristics. So I noticed that Steve put in the chat a link. You can click on that link and get it that way. But we will be using these band charts a lot. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on, but you should make a copy of these as best you can. Just a couple of notes before we move on. You'll notice that there are many of them. The FCC has allocated these bands historically for different amateur radio usage. And some of these started off as business bands that, as the FCC reallocated frequencies for different uses, they became available for amateur radio use. Some of these bands have evolved over time, particularly the higher frequency bands, as radio communications equipment has gotten better and better and better. We've been able to use higher and higher frequencies. So these bands have come into use because of that, because the equipment has evolved over time. So some of these bands were practical in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The HF bands were very popular in those days, but radio equipment didn't exist up into the 400 megahertz bands. Then over time, as radio equipment has gotten better, we've been able to use some of these bands. These bands typically are referred to with their approximate wavelength. So when we talk about in the upper right-hand corner, we talk about the 10-meter band. That's the approximate wavelength. You'll notice that if you multiply the frequency by the wavelength, that you roughly get about 300. So you'll notice that if you take 10 meters, multiply by its frequency in megahertz, which is 28 megahertz, you get 280, and that's close to 300. These are approximate bands, approximate wavelengths. And the reason for that will become obvious as we move forward, because the wavelength multiplied by the frequency is the speed of light. Radio waves are electromagnetic waves, and they have exactly the same property and characteristics that other electromagnetic waves have, like visible light and cosmic rays, radio waves. These are all electromagnetic waves, just at different wavelengths and different frequencies. So if you multiply the wavelength times the number of times that it goes up and down in a period of time, that will tell you what its speed is. So wavelength multiplied by the frequency in megahertz gives you roughly 300 million meters per second. And for those of you that are in high school and in junior high, you should know what the number 300 million meters per second is. That's the speed of light. So you'll notice for each one of these bands, if you multiply the wavelength and the megahertz together, you'll get close to 300. All righty. Any other questions before we move on? Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and move on. We will be coming back to this chart because this a lot of what the FCC has allocated for amateur radios will come back to this. We'll come back to this chart. All right, let's move on. All righty, so T1, which is for the technician exam, they've been grouped into 10. Each of all the questions in the question pool have been grouped into 10 different groups. The group we're going to be looking at this evening is T1, which are the FCC Commission's rules and regulations. There will be 6 questions on your exam. There are 6 subject areas that fall into this topic area. So you will have 6 questions on your exam. So of the 35 questions that will be on your exam, 6 of them will come from this evening's material. So it's important that you learn this. So question T1A 001, first question in the pool, is what is the following is the basis and purpose of an amateur radio service? If you look at Title 47, which is the Federal Communications Commission's portions of the FCC Code of Federal Regulations, you'll see that the FCC has defined the reason why amateur radio exists. Part 97 is the part of the Title 47 that has to do with amateur radio. So if you want to look up all the rules and regulations for amateur radio, you would look at Part 97. Each of the different radio services in the that the Federal Communications Commission regulates has their own part. So Part 97 is amateur radio. If you wanted to look at personal radio services, such as CB or GMRS or MERS, then you would look at Part 95. If you wanted to look at land mobile, which is business band radios, you'd look at Part 47. So each of the different services have different parts that the FCC has allocated. And the FCC in Part 97.1 lays out 5 reasons for why they've established amateur radio as a separate radio service in the United States. Part 1 A is it recognizes that amateur radio is part of providing services in the event of an emergency. So one of the reasons why they regulate us is because we have a history of doing and supporting amateur the radio services in the event of an emergency. You'll notice that's only one of 5 purposes. So emergency services is just a piece of overall what amateur radio does. Section B talks about the amateur's proven ability to contribute to the advancement of radio art. Many of the things that we discovered about radio and radio services, radio waves propagation, designing and building your own radio equipment and things like that is something that amateurs have done over the years. And the FCC recognizes that much of what it knows about with communications is because of the amateur radio service. The second thing, or the third thing, why amateur radio exists and why the FCC regulates the amateur radio service is because we like advancing our own skills towards the communications and technical phases of the art. That means me as an amateur radio service radio operator, I have interest in becoming better and better at communicating and using technical equipment, and the FCC helps regulate that to make sure that that process is as straightforward as possible. The fourth reason why the amateur radio exists is because at the time of emergencies and at the times of war and things like that, amateur radio operators have provided resources to get an initial pool of trained operators. One of the reasons why the FCC will publish your license information is because it knows that you are a trained radio operator. So it's tasked with keeping track of those resources. And that's one of the reasons why the license database is made public. And the last is a very interesting characteristic of amateur radio. Because radio waves do not behave and are not under the control of our political infrastructure, amateur radio operators have a long, long history of international goodwill that is done by amateur radio operators. Even at the height of the Cold War, amateur radio operators had friends in Moscow and in Southeast Asia, in China. Radio operators love talking to other radio operators. So there's a certain measure of international goodwill, even when individuals are not able to have a political discord. They can have a technical and a fun of using radio discord. You can routinely get in and talk to radio operators in Cuba and in China, in the Soviet Union, I guess the only place where we don't have this international goodwill, should surprise no one, is with North Korea, because North Korea does not license any amateur radio operators. But for the most of the rest of the world. So the answer to the question is to provide rules and regulations that help advance the development of skills in the communication and technical phases of the art, becoming better and better amateur radio operators. Question 2, who regulates and enforces the rules for amateur radio service in the United States? It's the Federal Communications Commission. So the radios that are on board your aircraft when you're flying are FCC certified. The radio operators on aircraft are licensed through the FCC, not through the FAA. Your radio stations, TV stations, cable stations, anything that has to do with communications is regulated and enforced through the Federal Communications Commission. Question B, 03. What are the FCC regulations as far as the phonetic alphabet? The phonetic alphabet was something that was developed around just prior to the World War II, when radio communications, verbal radio communications, was becoming so popular. And a phonetic alphabet is a way of spelling letters out using words. So rather than saying my call sign on the air, AE7TD, which can sound very garbled if there's a lot of interference, I say Alpha Echo 7 Tango Delta, which is my call sign in a phonetic alphabet. These words are chosen for specific reasons. They have hard consonant sounds in them, and they're very easy to recognize, even if you only caught one or two symbols or syllables of the word. You know what the word is. These are also been chosen based on different English accents. So this alphabet has evolved over time between World War II and the formulation of NATO. NATO now has an international standard that has evolved as more and more governments have become part of nations, have become part of NATO. They've evolved the phonetic alphabet to cover more and more English accents for British accents and French accents and things like that. So these words have changed over time. One of the things I love doing when I see a movie on TV is I can tell you what the time period is that the movie was shot at based on what phonetic alphabet is being used over the radio. So if you hear a radio where they're talking about Baker Company, that's probably World War II. If you see them talking about Bravo Company, then that is probably a NATO, because the word Bravo didn't come into the phonetic alphabet until the NATO was formed. What's the FCC's position around the use of the phonetic alphabet? They encourage it. They don't require it. They encourage it. So sometimes you'll hear people on the air that rather than saying Sierra, will say sugar, or rather than saying rather than saying Oscar for O, they'll say ocean. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to make their transmission stand out against other people that may be talking on the air, rather than trying to make sure their message is communicated clearly. So the FCC does not require you to use these words for the phonetic alphabet, but they highly encourage it. Any questions? Let's keep going on. So how many licenses are you allowed to hold at any one time? One. You're only allowed to have one station or operator license at a time. What does a license grant actually mean? And you are granted a license when it appears in the FCC database, the ULS database, and there's the URL, fcc.gov/ULS, and that's the database that you can go to it. When you see your call sign show up in that database, that means you've been issued a license. Many years ago, the FCC issued pieces of paper that were your license. And about 20 years ago, the definition of what a license was changed from being a piece of paper to being a record inside a database. So your call sign, which is the index into the ULS, is in effect your license. All right. Question 06, next question. What's the definition of a beacon? Well, when you see FCC Part 97 as part of the question, they're asking you, what does an amateur radio service beacon mean? A beacon is a one-way radio transmission that's used for the purposes of observing propagation and other experimental activities. So normally in amateur radio communications, you have to have two-way communications. You're talking to somebody and somebody is talking to you. You're not allowed to have one-way communications. By its very nature, a beacon is one-way communication. And so the only type of one-way communication that you can have with an amateur radio license is a beacon. Other than that, you must be having a two-way conversation with another radio amateur. Next question. Question number 7. What is the FCC Part 97 definition of a space station? Well, here we're looking at a specific definition. What is Part 97? So what's the amateur radio service definition of a space station? A space station is any amateur station located above 50 kilometers. So if it's located much above 40,000, 40,000, 40,000. If it's located above 50 kilometers, then that's considered a amateur station, a space station. So satellites, International Space Station, all of those would be considered a space station. Next question. Which of the following entities recommends transmit and receive channels and other parameters for repeaters? In amateur radio, we have every kind of major geographical area will have what's called a frequency coordinator. A frequency coordinator is responsible for making sure that two repeaters are not interfering with each other because they're located too close together. So if you want to have a series of transmit and receive frequencies that you know you're not conflicting with other people in the area, you contact your local frequency coordinator, and they have lists of coordinated repeaters, and you can see whether or not you're going to interfere with other people in your general area. Typically, a frequency coordinator is done at the state level. You may have, depending on how the state is geographically organized, more than one frequency coordinator for a state. So, for example, here in Washington State, I live in Western Washington outside of Seattle, and there is an organization called the Western Washington Amateur Relay Association that handles frequency coordination all through Western Washington. There's a different group out in Spokane that handles Eastern Washington on the eastern portion of the Cascades. So east of the Cascades is Eastern Washington, west of the Cascade Mountains is Western Washington. In addition to a list of coordinated repeaters, a frequency coordinator will also have a local band plan. So you see a rough band plan that the ARRL put together, which is that colored allocation chart that I asked you to download at the start of the class. That's kind of the generic, that's what the FCC has identified. But each local area could have their own more detailed breakout for what frequencies should be used and where. And so a frequency coordinator will also generate a local band plan. So those are the two things that you get from a local frequency coordinator. These for the next question, question 9, who selects a frequency coordinator? And we do. Local amateur radios operators get together, decide who the frequency coordinator will be, and so it's a voluntary selection of a frequency coordinator. What is the Amateur Radio Civil Emergency Services, RACES? What is it? And the answer to the question is all of those represent what RACES is. RACES actually, depending on how old you are, you may remember the Civil Defense Organization that we used to have here in the United States, where you would have civil defense, bomb shelters, and organizations that were responsible for dealing with civil defense. And that's what ultimately on the radio side where RACES evolved from. So if the president declares a national emergency and would bring civil defense into the picture to operate radios to be able to have government services still work, that's what RACES is responsible for doing. All right. Next question. When is willful interference with other amateur radio stations permitted? It should surprise you that the answer is at no time. At no time is it valid for you to interfere with some other radio station. So just because you dislike what they're saying, just because you think that you own the frequency, just because of whatever reason you want to feel that it's your responsibility to interfere with another radio station, that is not permitted, and that's one of the items that the FCC will come at you about, because we are expected to all be good citizens of the uses of the amateur radio spectrum, and we're expected to be respectful of each other, and we cannot willfully interfere with other amateur radio stations. Unfortunately, that happens from time to time. All right. Next major section talks about talks about frequencies and the different bands that we can use. Which of the following frequencies ranges are available for phone operation? So again, the amateur radio operators, we have our own terminology. And when we talk about a phone, we don't mean a telephone, we mean a microphone. So whenever you hear an amateur radio operator talking about phone operation, what they're talking about is using a microphone to communicate with somebody. If you're using a computer to computer, that would be digital communications. If you're using Morse code, that would be CW or continuous wave communications. If you're using the code that the old radio teletypes would use during World War II, that's called RTTY. When you hear somebody talk about phone operations, they're talking about microphone. They're talking about you talking to somebody else talking to you. Let's see here. So is anybody else watching the chat that can answer that question for Mark about the...
I'll take it.
Very good. Thank you. All righty. Next couple of questions talk about the International Space Station. Who was allowed to talk to the International Space Station on the VHF bands? VHF is all radio communications between 30 megahertz and 300 megahertz. That's what VHF means. And the answer, who can talk? Anybody holding a technician class license or higher. So there's no special license that's needed for you to be able to talk to the International Space Station. Just a technician license is perfectly fine to be able to talk to the International Space Station. There's no special license or special rules associated talking to the ISS. All righty, there are a couple of questions on the exam. B03, B04 are examples of where they ask you what frequency is in the 6 meter band, and they give you a bunch of frequencies. And in B04, they give you a frequency and they ask you what band it's in. So you have two options when you are studying for the exam. One is you can remember all the band edges for each question. If you want to memorize, if you're a very detailed person and you want to memorize the edges of the bands, you can memorize those and you'll be able to answer these questions. The second thing that you can do is you can visualize this circle that I gave you here, which basically allows you to convert from wavelength to frequency or frequency to wavelength. So the way this formula works is you take your thumb and you put it over top of the variable that you're trying to solve, and then 300 over the other variable is what the formula is. So in this case, if you're looking for what's in the 6 meter band, so you take your thumb, you put it over the wavelength, which is the lambda symbol that's there. That's the wavelength in meters, in 6 meters. So 300 divided by 6 is somewhere around 50 megahertz. And if you look at all of the frequencies that are there, there's only one that's close to 50 megahertz. Similar with 146.52 in megahertz, it asks you what band it is. So you take your thumb and you put it over the wavelength, which is what you're trying to solve for. 300 divided by 146 is somewhere around 2. And so that will be the 2 meter band. So you can either memorize the band edges, or you can use this formula to solve all the questions. Alrighty, how may amateurs use the 219 to 220 megahertz segment on the 1.25 meter band? So if you look at the ARRL band plan, if you have that in front of you, look at that in front of you. And look at the 1.25 meter band. What will you notice at the front of the lower portions of the band? It will say that those frequencies are limited to fixed point-to-point digital message forwarding systems. What these are is these are radio stations that can be used to transmit email messages. So amateur radio has a portion of the 1.25 meter band, which is allocated and used for fixed digital message forwarding systems, i.e. email, that allows you to transmit email from one station to another. And ultimately, then they have gateways that hook up that email to the internet, and you can send email. This is a very common thing for emergency services groups, where you will send radio could be down, for example, all through the Seattle area. But if you can get a radio signal out to, let's say, some radio station that's outside of the affected area, like into Colorado, they have gateways in other states that will then hook you up to the internet from there. And so you can send and receive email messages even if the internet is down in your area. A lot of emergency services use that particular feature. That's called WinLink, WINLINK. Alrighty, on which HF bands does a technician class operator have phone privileges? Remember, when we say phone, we mean microphone privileges. So this is voice communications. This is you picking up a microphone and talking to somebody else. The HF bands is where shortwave allows you to bounce your signal off of the ionosphere, so you can get long-range communications from your radio. VHF and higher, 150 megahertz and higher. You're only going to get line of sight propagation because there's so much energy in the radio signal that it just travels straight through the ionosphere. It won't get bounced off of the ionosphere, which is what shortwave station will allow you to do. But there is one band, the 10 meter band, where as a technician, you're allowed you have phone privileges. Most of the other HF bands, you only have Morse code or CW privileges as a technician. So if you want to learn Morse code, you can still use the HF bands, but you need to use Morse code. You can't use your microphone. Which of the following VHF/UHF band segments are limited to CW only? Take a look at the chart and look at the bottom portion of the 6-meter band and the 2-meter band. And what you'll notice is they all have this little squiggly line all the way at the bottom of the band. And those bands are limited to CW only. All of the other VHF, UHF bands are voice only. But at the bottom of the 6-meter and at the bottom of the 2-meter bands, you'll see that you can use Morse code. And there are some ham radio operators that will use Morse code on those bands because it has a particular radio propagation characteristics that you'll use. I'll leave that discussion on over to the propagation people to talk about. Keep going. How are U.S. amateurs restricted in segments of bands where the amateur radio service is secondary? There is so much demand for radio frequencies these days as the FCC has allocated primary, secondary, and tertiary uses for most of the electromagnetic spectrum. The only difference is in most of the amateur radio services in our allocations, we are a primary only and we don't share it with anybody else. That's because we're considered to be a little bit more public. But for most of the other frequencies, there is primary, secondary, and tertiary users that have been assigned. Sometimes that's the military. Sometimes that's business band radio. Sometimes, well, there's all kinds of different users of the segments. The difference is in some of our segments, we are secondary. So at the bottom portion of the 70 centimeter band, which is a very common band that we use, we share that band with radar locations around airports. So if you are listening to the radio and you hear a buzzing signal on the radio on the 70 centimeter band where we're secondary, then you must move and you should not interfere with them. So when you listen and hear interference on some of the amateur radio bands, we may not be primary on that band and we must move and we must not interfere with them. Sometimes it's hard to detect what a radar station looks like, but you need to be careful. All righty. B09, why should you not set your transmit frequency exactly on the edge of an amateur radio band? And all three of these things can happen. Number one, so you might have the display that you're looking at may be slightly off in its calibration. So you think you're right on the edge, but in reality, you're actually transmitting outside of the band and could be interfering with some allocation that's being done right up against the amateur radio band. So you need to be careful. You need to back off a little bit to make sure that you give room that if you did have some kind of a calibration error that you would not interfere with the radio station on the other side. Sometimes the modulation subband that you're using could extend beyond the band edge. So for example, if you're on, let's say you were on 6 meters, and 6 meters uses upper sideband for its subband. And so if you set your frequency for right on the edge for your carrier, then you may be transmitting outside of the amateur radio band because you're using upper sideband as the modulation type. And modulation types is another, you'll get that in another class if you haven't already heard about what the difference is between AM, FM, single sideband, Morse code. CW, and all the digital modulation techniques. If you haven't heard about that, if that sounds unusual, then that will be coming up in another class. And the third thing that can happen is this particularly happened in the old days, where that everything was tubes rather than solid state devices. You would have frequency drift that as the tube in your transmitter would warm up, it would start drifting off from the frequency that you had it set for. So if you turned your radio on, if you set it for right on the band edge, as the tube warms up, the frequency could drift off to a frequency that's outside of the band if you start out right on the edge. So all of those things can happen. And that's why you would not transmit right on the edge. Where may single sideband phone, this is microphone, voice transmissions, be used in the amateur radio bands above 50 megahertz? And at least some portion of every band above 50 megahertz has at least some segment that you could use your voice to be able to transmit on. B11 question. What is the maximum power output for technician class operators in the HF bands? If you look at the ARRL band plan, you'll see it's 200 watts. You cannot transmit with more than 200 watts. B12 basically says that outside of that, what's the maximum peak envelope power that you can transmit? And it's 1,500 watts. 1,500 watts beyond that. Alrighty, the next couple of questions talk about call signs. So I want to do a basic introduction to call signs. Call signs are a short method to show that you have a license that you can transmit. Now, you've actually seen call signs today, even though you may not be aware of it. You may listen on the radio or on the TV where they have a KOMO, K-O-M-O, King, K-I-N-G, Cairo. Those are all radio stations and TV stations. The fact that they start with the letter K means that they're located west of the Mississippi. If you look at radio stations that are east of the Mississippi, they start with a W, like WABC out of New York City. So these are all call signs, and call signs are a way of uniquely identifying transmitting agencies within the world. Every ham radio operator has a unique call sign. My call sign is AE7TD. There is no other person in the world that has the call sign of AE7TD. In the United States, all call signs start with the letters W, K, N, or A. And then, as you can see, there are other countries that then have different call signs that have been assigned to them. Here in the United States, it's broken up again. So when you say AE7, the number 7 is my call sign district, which, as you can see, is mostly West Coast states, except for California that has their own. There's enough ham radio operators in the state of California that they get their own call area dedicated to just California. And then you can see the layout. So when you get your initial call sign, your call sign will have a 7 as the middle element. So every call sign has a prefix, a call area, and then a suffix. And depending on what license class you have, you may or may not be able to have different combinations of letters for your prefix and your suffix. And then you see there are some call signs that are allocated geographically. So if you live in Alaska, you'll get a KL7 call sign. If you live in Hawaii, you'll get a KH6 or KH7. So are some call signs. And if you get into the Caribbean, in the Caribbean, they have KP3 and KP4 for Puerto Rico, and you can see some of the other designations there. That indicates that you're down in the Caribbean. And worldwide, there's an organization called the ITU, which is an agency of the United Nations that defines prefixes for every country worldwide. And you can see the allocation for the United States. So it's actually the ITU that has decided that for the United States, all call signs will start with K, N, W, and A. So the ITU defines what the prefix will be, and then the country can decide from there how they're going to allocate call signs within them. Call signs are organized into groups. There's a 2x2 call sign, which is sequentially assigned. This is the call sign that you will get when you get your initial call sign. And then if you wish to ask for a vanity call sign after that, you could get a 1x3, which is available to technician licensees. If you have an extra class license, you can get a 2x2, such as what I have. The letter A means that you are an extra class amateur radio operator also. If you have a 2x1 and a 1x2 for the number of letters in the suffix and the prefix, then that also indicates that you're an extra only license class holder. You don't have to change your license, your call sign to do this. It's just that it's available to you if you'd like to be able to do it. And then there are such things as 1x1 special event call signs that you can request be assigned to you. So, for example, when we go out to the Girl Scout activities for Girl Scout Thinking Day in, I think it's March, we always ask for the 1x1 call sign of N7W, just as a way of having a special call sign that we can use for that event. And so these are the types of call signs. There are special event calls we just talked about, 1x1, limited duration. You can't ask for it forever. You only get it for a particular time. There are sequentially assigned call signs that typically are used for new hams. Clubs can have their own call signs, and you have something called a vanity call that allows you to assign and choose your own if it's not already been allocated. What are the types of licenses, license classes that are currently available from the FCC? And the answer is Technician, General, and Amateur Extra. There are other license classes. At one point in time, there were novices, and one point in time, there were advanced. And for advanced licensees and novice licensees, they can renew their license, and the FCC will grandfather them in, allow them to keep their call sign as long as they keep it continuously renewed. And who can select a vanity call sign? As long as it's not been assigned to anybody else, any licensed amateur can request a vanity call sign. They may not be able to get all of the call signs that they want because they're limited by license class and they are limited by geography. But if you'd like to be able to get one, you can request it. Costs $35 today. What kind of international communications are permitted? And you're allowed to make any international communication that is consistent with the amateur radio service and is remarks of a personal character. Meaning you can ask about the weather, you can ask about what kind of antenna and radio they might have. You can't ask them whether or not, how much you can't sell something to somebody in another country. So it has to be limited to the purpose of the amateur radio service and personal information. When you do sign up for a license, what will happen if the FCC is unable to connect with you via email? And the answer is you could have your license and your operating
Hello, Buster.
license and your station license could be suspended.
Hello, Buster.
Say again? Just heard someone? All right, let's move on. Let's see here. Which of the following, they list a bunch of amateur radio call signs for a technician class, and the answer is KF1XXX. Everything else is has one or two letters in the suffix. And that's limited to extra class operators. Which of the following locations may an FCC licensed amateur radio station transmit? And it shouldn't surprise anybody if you've ever been on an international ship. If the vessel is flagged and registered in the United States, then your amateur radio license is valid in international water. You may need to ask the ship's captain for permission, because you don't want to have your radio interfere with any radio operations that the ship needs to conduct. But other than that, you're free to use your license on board a U.S. flagged ship. So C07 is just the reverse of the other one. So you have to have a valid email address. Current, how long is an amateur radio license good for? It's good for 10 years. What's the grace period if you have the radio license expire? You have 2 years to renew it, and then you can get your call sign and your old license class back. If you go beyond the grace period, then you have to retest to be able to get your license back and your old call sign back. How soon can you transmit? As soon as your license appears in the FCC license database in the ULS. So just because you pass your exam doesn't mean you can immediately go out and start to transmit. You have to have a call sign to identify yourself, and you don't get a call sign until you're licensed from the FCC and you show up in the ULS database. So as soon as you show up in the ULS database, which is typically a 3, 4, or 5 day activity, depending on how long it takes you to pay your $35 application fee, is how long it will take before you can operate. Once your license expired and you're within the 2-year grace period, are you allowed to transmit? Answer is no. As soon as your license expires, then you must wait for the license to be renewed. And how do you know it's renewed? It's when it shows up as renewed in the ULS database. With what country are you allowed to communicate? You're allowed to communicate with any country unless they have prohibited exchange of information. Right now, the 2 countries that do not license any of their citizens is Yemen and North Korea. Yemen will allow other countries to come in and operate in country, but they do not license their own citizens. And North Korea doesn't allow anybody to either come in or operate a radio inside their country. Under what of the following circumstances are one-way transmissions of amateur radios prohibited? You're prohibited to broadcast. So broadcast is an FCC term for one-way communications. So your normal radio and television signals are intended for general public, and that's what the FCC called broadcasting, and you're not permitted to do that when you have an amateur radio license. Amateur radio licenses is 2-way communications between amateurs. When can you transmit encoded signals that obscure its meaning? When can you encrypt your messages? The only place where the FCC allows you to do that is when you're communicating with a space station or a remote control aircraft. Other than that, you're not allowed to encrypt any amateur radio communications. It must be out in the open where other people can hear it and decode it. Same thing about being able to authorize transmit of music. The only thing that is allowed is for manned aircraft communications. Other than that, music is only allowed on broadcast stations. As an amateur radio operator, you're not allowed to retransmit or transmit music. You're also not allowed to sell anything or make the use of amateur radio equipment for any fiduciary activity, except that you are allowed to sell radio equipment if you don't do it on a regular basis. So you can't have a business out there selling amateur radio equipment. But if you have a swap meet or something like that, where you want to have people come out and purchase your radio equipment, as long as it's not done on a regular basis, you're allowed to do that. Are there any restrictions concerning the transmission of language that might be considered indecent and obscene? It should surprise you not that that language is prohibited. The FCC does not define what that language would be. The way we describe this with scouts is we tell them any words that their grandmother would not allow them to use cannot be used on the radio. We used to say parents, but parents don't have a good reputation these days as far as filtering their language sometimes. So we switched to grandparents. Are there amateur radio stations that can automatically retransmit the signals of other stations? This is, yes, you can. And this is probably one of the biggest features of amateur radio, is that we do have a very, very extensive infrastructure of stations out there that will retransmit their signals, repeaters and space stations. Under what circumstances may a control operator of an amateur radio station receive compensation for operating that station? Only if you're doing classroom instruction with an educational institution. Other than that, you can't use amateur radio for business purposes. There are other services that if you wanted to do that, you could. GMRS, for example, CB, for example, are radio services that do allow you to use and make receive compensation for operating a station. When may amateur radio operators stations broadcast information, broadcasting, news gathering, assuming no other means are available? This is one of the escape clauses that the FCC has. When such communication is directly related to the immediate safety of human life, protection of property. What that means is if you're going to save somebody's life by sending news information with amateur radio, you're allowed to do that. Other than that, you're not allowed. You must be licensed in your amateur station. Must do normal two-way communications. How does the FCC define broadcasting on the amateur radio service? That's transmissions intended for the general public. We're not allowed to do that. Broadcasting is for radio, TV, and other radio services. We are not allowed to broadcast with amateur radio. When may you transmit a radio without identifying on the air? And the only place where you're not required to do identification, is when you're using model aircraft. And then what you have to do is you have to put a label on the transmitter that you're using to control your model aircraft. You put your call sign information on the label on the transmitter. When are you allowed to transmit without a control operator? Never. You must have a control operator. Someone must be responsible for the transmissions from the radio at all time. When may a control operator communicate with a satellite or space station? As long as you're a licensed amateur, you can transmit on the satellite uplink, then you're allowed to talk to that space station or satellite. Who must designate the control operator for a station? And that's the station licensee. Whoever is the station licensee for a radio determines who the control operator is. What determines the frequency privileges of an amateur station? It's the control operator. It's the person who is actually pushing the transmitter, the control operator, the person that's actually controlling the station. That's the frequency privileges that they're allowed to use. And what's an amateur station control point? It's where the control operator is. Under normal circumstances, may a technician class licensee operate in the extra band at no time. If you're a control operator, you must only use your frequency privileges. If the control operator is not the station licensee, who's responsible for the station? The FCC considers it both the control operator and the station licensee. They don't want to get into little kids pointing the finger at each other at who's responsible. The FCC considers both responsible. What's an example of automatic control? Repeater is a good example of automatic control. The repeater controls its own transmission of a signal. If you're going to have a remote control operation, what must be required? All of these are required. And what's an example of remote control? It's operating the station across the internet. So if you have a radio station at home, you can use your laptop while you're off traveling and control your station, and that's what remote control is about. Who does the FCC assume the control operator is of an amateur radio station? It assumes that's the station licensee, unless the station has some kind of a log or something that defines for them who the control operator is. You must make your records available to the FCC if they come knocking at your door. When they request access to the station, any records that may be available. In addition to when we talked about call signs, you can also have tactical call signs, which is where you're going to define what role you have in some organization. When do you identify? At the end of every conversation, at the end of every 10 minutes. When are you required to transmit your call sign? At least 10 minutes during and at the end of the conversation. You must use English to identify yourself. You're not required to use English when you talk on the radio, but you're required to use English when you're identifying yourself. And you're welcome to send your call sign either verbally or using Morse code. Most repeaters, or many repeaters, identify using Morse code. You can use either Morse code or speaking with your voice. That's a phone transmission. If you'd like to use your own identifier after your call sign, you're welcome to do that. And these are any of these three valid answers are on the exam. Who can you talk to in another country? If you're talking to another station in another country, and the person that you're talking to is not a licensed individual in that country, then that country must be listed on a list that the United States has for third-party communications. And so there's a list. You can go to the ARRL, and they have a long list of countries that have third-party agreements, and you're allowed to talk to unlicensed individuals in that country. The reason for this is in days gone past, there were very expensive international telephone calls, and sending telegrams and things like that was very expensive. And people started using amateur radios to be able to talk to people in other countries, even if they were not licensed. And so they shut that down, and you have to have a third-party agreement between the United States and that third-party country to be able to talk to a non-licensed person in that country. And question F08 asks you what third-party communication is, and it's what we just talked about. And what's a repeater? Repeater is a station that retransmits the signal on another frequency. If you're on a repeater and you say something bad, who's responsible? You are. The control operator for the repeater is not responsible. You're responsible if you say a bad word or you conduct business or for something like that on a repeater. You're responsible for that. And when we talked about club licensees, club call signs, we said, what is a club? A club is an organization that has at least 4 members, and then you can get a club call sign if you would like to. Have to have at least 4 members. And that was it. Any questions? I apologize for running long. Any questions from the class before we move on?